Hello, everyone. This is Rebecca Sive, a guest with Sophie and Kelly on the Voter In segment of Two Broads. And welcome to this show. We're really excited about doing this. We're hoping that you'll find it interesting and valuable and inspirational. And most important, we're looking forward to sharing what we know and working together to make this dream of voting in our next woman president come true. So let your friends know, welcome, and let's get going. Thanks.
Are you listening?
Hi, everyone. This is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics. I'm joined by my co-host, Sophie. Hey, Sophie.
Hey, Kelly.
And we're joined in this segment, the fourth segment of Vote Her In, by our partner, Rebecca Sive. Hi, Rebecca.
Good morning.
So if you are just catching us for the first time, as I mentioned, this is the fourth episode of the Vote Her In series, and we're discussing the effort to elect the first woman president. And we've gone through sort of the history of women presidential candidates, and we are now up to Hillary Clinton, who's, of course, extremely important in this story. And I will say I still have a little bit of maybe low-level PTSD from the 2016 election, so it's a little bit hard to talk about sometimes, but I think there's some really important lessons for us to think about, to talk about. So, Rebecca, can you talk a little bit about sort of the way you want to frame this discussion?
Well, you know what I was thinking about, it's obvious, there have been hundreds, if not thousands of articles and people's talks about what happened and why it happened. But I thought for our purposes, we might try to, we should focus on the kind of structural aspects of being a female candidate for executive office versus a male candidate, and what the Clinton experience in 2008 and in 2016 showed us, and how to think about that going forward. So it's not so much, kind of a postmortem on Hillary, although I too suffer from that PTSD, but a sort of look ahead and, what are those fundamental issues that the women candidates are going to need to address, in order to prevail. So I had sort of made a list of those, and, when I was thinking about it, and I've seen this now in some of the stuff that's starting to be written, it kind of occurred to me that, sort of first base, as it were, is the notion that the idea of executive power, of a person being the ultimate decision maker, is essentially rooted in the idea of maleness, right? That, that's how we've always, that's how it's always been, so that's how it always ought to be. So the woman who says, I want to be an executive, whether it's in government or business or elsewhere, is, quote, kind of the other. She's different. She's not part of the norm of who is it that gets to be the executive. So that, women are sort of starting out with this, in this secondary status until, I guess, enough women are in executive positions that, the notion of being an executive is not, that's a man, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think we see that in a lot of contexts, certainly in government. That's in part why we're trying to elect a woman president, to begin to change that norm. But there's been writing in philosophy and other places on this, but the sort of straight up acknowledgement that, in each of our heads, executive is male, right? Just like it used to be, for instance, the person in charge is always going to be a white man, right? Mm-hmm. And only through the, decades of fighting for change do people see a broader array of people who might be that, chief person.
Yeah, and I think we had talked in a previous episode before we started this series about the idea that women more often rise to the top level of power in their country in parliamentary systems.
Right.
And in part, that's because they're seen as more consensus builders than sort of executive, powerful people. And, so we're seeing recently in the news a lot, Jacinda Ardern, who is the prime minister in New Zealand and who very clearly has a very different style than a lot of male presidents and prime ministers who we've seen in the past. But, it's very significant, I think, that she came up in a parliamentary system, and her becoming the prime minister was a result of a negotiation between a few different parties to sort of establish, the most seats in the parliament. And so I wonder, would a 38-year-old woman have become prime minister if it was an election?
Well, the other thing about that, to your point, is that she's essentially, when she was negotiating that and, seeking to become the prime minister, she was essentially dealing with a relatively modest number of people, all of whom are her peers, right? Mm-hmm. In other words, other members of the party, other legislators. So, that's just such a different context from the idea that, individual people put themselves out there in a primary that, can hold a couple dozen people, as we almost have now in the Democratic primary, and makes her case solo. She's not, negotiating with peers. She's fighting against them every step of the way. So I think you're right. It's a very different kind of context. And, when people talk about, well, when other countries have done this, why can't we? I think, we need to remember that the whole system is set up so differently.
One thing that you had also noted on your list of points, and I think is really important as a follow-up to this, is the idea that the woman who tries to get there, so in a system like ours, in a system where we are electing by the people and not in this small group of people, that the first few women who try to do this are, since they're trying to break the norm, are going to be seen as troublemakers.
This is such a profound piece of the story, and for every woman to remember, and for us to take into consideration, for instance, in some cases when people, are critical of these women who are the first. And, it's true in other, so to speak, out groups too. But that first person who sort of bangs on the door and says, I demand to get in the room, right? By definition, that's making trouble. And so there's always this, diminution of who that person is. And, well, if we let her in the room, she's not going to be a team player, and she's always going to be too aggressive, or she's not going to, hang with us in the way that we all need to hang together to make the decisions. And I think if you look back in history at some of the women who have really, forged ahead in this way, they've suffered as a consequence. They weren't the first person to be elected to X job or become the CEO or become, achieve some other leadership position. And you certainly see that in contemporary, African American history, which is really sort of analogous in the presidential context, where Jesse Jackson, ran for president twice in the 80s, and did well, but couldn't get all the way there, whereas Barack Obama could. And they had very different routes to running. And Jackson was a, so to speak, outside agitator, and, Obama was in the system, right? So it's, I think, an important challenge for women. And, it's probably the case that Hillary Clinton, as nice a person as I'm told she is perceived that way. She banged on the door. She got in. Mm-hmm. She 18 million cracks in the glass ceiling. Well, that's pretty scary.
I mean, I'll never forget how people in the media described Hillary Clinton repeatedly as being ambitious. Yes. And I see this a little bit with Kirsten Gillibrand recently, mm-hmm. too. And I'm just like, okay, but literally everyone who runs for president is by definition, ambitious. Exactly. That's kind of the whole point. So it's interesting to me how we assign ambition a negative value for women, but a positive value for men.
Well, I mean, I can speak, from my own experience. I'm sure you all can too. I mean, there's the proverbial stories about girls not raising their hands in class, right? Mm-hmm. And so then they wait to be called on, and maybe if they're called on enough and give good answers, they're let in the room because she's really smart and really nice, and she waited her turn. Whereas, the young woman who raised her hand and said, I know the answer, is perceived negatively. So it's mm-hmm. This is an issue not only for these adult women, but, to make sure that young girls don't feel that they're, having to sit back because otherwise they won't have opportunity. I mean, that would just be, it is devastating.
I wonder if, given that the person they are all running against this time mm-hmm. is Donald Trump, and there is no more aggressive, unsuitable, not team player kind of person in the, at least in this country, than Donald Trump right now. I wonder, does that make it even more important for Democrats that they pick someone who is sort of, plays by the rules, or does it give us a little bit of freedom to pick someone who's an agitator? Kirsten Gillibrand, since you brought her up, Sophie, her whole theme right now is brave. We need someone who's brave, who will stand right. up to Trump. And, I wonder how successful that will be. And, is that a thing that a woman can pull off?
It's a sort of interesting fact because on the one hand, you're right. They are pushing in a way that a group of women has never been able to push before. On the other hand, it's a group, right? There are, 4 at least, really credible candidates, and there's some safety in those numbers, it seems to me. And secondly, in the fact that they've all had these long, professional lives as public officials where they've had, to negotiate and make compromises and stuff like that. It's a really interesting question you're raising because I think on the one hand, they could look on paper if it was a blind test like a lot of the guys they might be running against. But on the other hand, she's a woman, right? What does that mean? She's an outsider to how many, years have we had a president? And it may be, of course, we're speaking the day after the Mueller report was issued, at least to some people. I guess the AG, it may be that now that that came out the way it did, that those who may have thought that, gee whiz, this man was just too evil for me, and it's been predominantly women, as you know, who have moved away from him, whether they go back to him and say, well, gee, he was wronged, and we need a strong guy like him, and sometimes he may speak out of turn, but that's what we need. So maybe it's a little early to tell. I'm just not sure.
Well, and so that may then lead us to our next point, which is this idea that you had put that women need to be morally purer than men. I mean, I think right. I'd push it even a step further that women just can't make any mistakes at all mm-hmm. of any kind, and that maybe it's because we have so much trouble seeing women as executives in the first place that anything they do that doesn't comport with how we expect executives to behave, whatever that means, is immediately pounced on. And obviously we saw that a lot in 2016. Everything that Hillary did practically was just raked over the coals for, and especially obviously the email. I hesitate to even call it a scandal. The email situation. But we're seeing it already this year, I think, a lot for the women candidates.
You know what? This notion, starting with the idea of, so to speak, being morally pure goes way back in American mm-hmm. history. If you look at those women, we kind of touched around them a couple of weeks ago in the 20th century, Jane Addams and Ida B. Wells and that whole generation of progressive reformers, their main sort of legitimating statement about why they were engaging in civic life so forcefully was not, I see something, I want to fix it, it's a problem. But we're the, quote, so to speak, housekeepers. We clean up. There's actually language about that in some speeches and so on. And they sort of felt that they had to fall back on, the traditional role of women to clean up messes, and they could do that because they were purer than men. And we have continued to see that, and we've continued to see, as you point out, Kelly, that for women who seem to be somewhat, so to speak, compromised, depending on your view of their actions, that they're not adhering to that standard. So, Hillary, as you point out, was pilloried, whereas what Trump has done, it's such magnitudes of difference, at least what the allegations are. I can't see how it goes away exactly is also a challenge here, but perhaps it will a bit because, again, we have several women running simultaneously. But I think, this notion of purity and housekeeping and cleaning out the mess, but I think that perhaps it'll be mitigated somewhat, although I think you're right that the notion, which is a little different of, they can't make mistakes, right, is probably going to be there, for them in a way. I mean, we've seen some examples already of the failure of the media to view some of the male candidates along the same criteria as the women. And, why is that, right?
Yeah, and, I think it doesn't go away immediately, but I think we have seen this cycle far more than we saw in 2016, people pushing back right away when things happen in coverage. And I think that is really important. And I think it gives a voice to those of us who feel that nagging in the back of our heads every time that, we see something like that and go, wait, that doesn't look right. And because other people are speaking up, then I feel more empowered to speak up about it myself and push back. And, I think the tricky part about it, that I have seen so far, is trying to make it clear that the critique is of the media and not of the male candidates. And so there are things I may or may not like about some of the male candidates, but I'm trying to frame my critiques of the coverage. That if, Beto got this huge spread in Vanity Fair and, he got a big rollout and a lot of the was very problematic, but he wasn't the problematic one in that. What's problematic is Vanity Fair pushing that out. The problem is people focusing on it. Because if everyone gets equal coverage, then all of the voters can make decisions for ourselves, right? I can say, well, I may think this person has better policies than this person. But if I'm never given a chance to equally see policies, I'm not ever given a chance to equally see experience, then that affects how you are able to accurately look at the candidates and make good decisions about who the best one is and who the best one is, who fits what you think who should be our candidate.
I think I agree with you that, demanding equal coverage so that we as voters have equal opportunity across the board to evaluate is important. But I would say the fundamental problem, this goes back to sort of these systemic issues in our first point here, the fundamental problem that goes deeper than that is this sort of ingrained sense, apparently, that, men and women don't have to be equally qualified. And that, for instance, in the case of Beto compared to any one of these four women, he's not equally qualified, that he should still be considered as seriously, one manifestation being media coverage, but it's not the only one. So I think that, we not only, you're right, have to push for equal media coverage, but for, are we looking at these people with the same set of criteria before they even get covered by the newspaper? Are we letting them in the door, so to speak, according to the same, qualifications, or do some people have an opportunity that others don't have, and those some happen to be men?
Yeah, I guess we can keep exploring that further.
Yeah.
I mean, there are all sorts of ways, not just maleness, of course, that some people are going to have more ability to get a foot in the door, and I think that's important, and it is a systemic problem, and it is something that we need to think about and address. But once everyone gets in the door and they're there already, we need to think carefully about how can we best evaluate candidates, and how can we push back when we're not given the opportunity to do a thorough, fair evaluation.
I think that's right. I think there's also a chance there for women who want to be a part of this movement to elect a woman president to say, well, I'm going to work for one of these women because I just want to make sure and be as helpful as I can to her having that equal opportunity. And, that's something that I had a chance to talk to some people about, last week, and sort of just say to them, well, gee whiz, if these two candidates look comparable, why not go with the woman? Because there will be a different voice at the table.
And, I think that one of the things we're seeing is the women are having more trouble meeting this criteria that the DNC has put on who will get to be in the debates. And one of those is donations from 65,000 different individuals. And so I've made a point of going and giving $5 to each of the women. All they're looking at is how many people are donating. And so it's really important, if we want to see those people on stage, if we want to see those voices, even if you don't think one of them is the one you're ultimately going to vote for, that we give them that support so at least they are in the mix and get a chance to amplify their messages.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I kind of, in thinking about that, we're just kind of being smart, right? Giving these women every kind of help we can give them. Having them be able to make their case in all these different places.
All right. So I think we have tugged at some really important threads here. And I'm hoping everyone who is listening will sort of ruminate on some of this, think about it, start to see it as you're looking through social media, as you're watching the news, sort of start to pick out these things. We'd love it if you sort of tweet these at us as examples of what we're talking about. And then we'll continue in the next episode, which will be 2 weeks from now, to look at some more of these structural systemic issues that we're seeing. And by that point, we will have results from several different mayoral races that are happening all over the country on April 2nd, and can start to see sort of what that looks like in terms of, what are we seeing in terms of women? What are we seeing in terms of sort of, being part of the system or outside the system, and can look a little bit at that sort of executive power as well.
Yeah, that's going to be great. I can't wait to have us kind of, we started this conversation earlier in the month and making the point about, for instance, how historic the Chicago mayoral will be. So it'll be terrific to be able at the sort of back end of it say, well, what have we learned, and what does this perhaps mean for the presidential? So I'm looking forward to talking further.
All right. Excellent. As always, everyone, we would love your feedback, your suggestions, your thoughts. So please feel free to email or contact us on Twitter or Facebook. We're everywhere. So don't hesitate to reach out. And if you're interested in the presidential election, Two Broads Talking Politics is also doing a presidential book club now. We're going to read the books by the presidential candidates, and we're starting off with one of the women, Kamala Harris. And that will be, you're listening to this on Friday, and it will be on Monday. So read along with us, and we'll talk about what we can learn about the candidates from their books.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Vote Her In segment is a collaboration of Two Broads Talking Politics and author Rebecca Sive. Our theme song is called Are You Listening, off of the album Elephant Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at Two Broads Talk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.